Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of this lecture on World War II in Canada and Quebec, and the conscription debate. Let's get up this PowerPoint again here. Oh, there's the beginning. Right, so we were there before. Here we go. So if you don't recognize him, this gentleman over here is Sir Mackenzie, Prime Minister Mackenzie King. Is he Sir Mackenzie? I'm not sure. I don't think he is. Okay. By 1942, the Second World War looked very different from in 1940. Okay. In June 1941, Hitler broke his non-aggression pact with Stalin, and he invaded the Soviet Union, opening up an enormous Eastern front. Okay, that ran. Actually, you know what? Let's go back here. Opening up an enormous Eastern front that ran off this map all the way to the Arctic Circle. Okay, all the way down to the Black Sea and even down here. Okay, so the German army is now in all of this. They've entered Romania. They were already in these countries. They would later enter Hungary, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Greece fought terrible, terrible wars against the Nazis. Italy was now part of it as well. So it had become a much, much wider war. So yeah, it had become a much, much wider war. And then 6 months later in the Pacific, you may know in December 1941, Japan attacked British, French, Dutch, and American positions in the Pacific, including Pearl Harbor. And that forced the Americans into the war. Germany had conquered almost all of Europe, okay, all the way from Spain here to the Russian border, to almost the end of Moscow. All of this, with the exception of Switzerland, was part of basically the German Empire, okay, the Nazi Empire. But the thing with conquering land is it's one thing to conquer it, it's another thing to hold it. The German high command didn't know this at the time, but it was Hitler's invasion of Russia which would end up destroying them. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor also ended up being one of the greatest military mistakes in the history of warfare. Germany and Japan basically are fighting alone, and they would now have to compete with the combined military and industrial might of the British, American, and Soviet empires. All right. To give you an idea of what this meant, the city of Oshawa, Ontario alone, okay, not the powerhouse of the Allied forces by any means, okay? They produced a bomber a day, okay? 365 bombers a year out of one town, factory town, okay? This was being done all across North America, all through Britain, all through the Soviet Union, which most of the factories are behind the Ural Mountains, which means that the Nazis can't get to them. I mean, the US alone, think about the amount of factory power that they're producing, okay, versus two countries that are relatively cut off, okay? So the Axis powers could not compete with that, okay? Especially when and also when the German factories, of course, are being bombed into sand by British, American, and Canadian bombers. So from here on, it would basically just be total war until Germany and Japan were forced into unconditional surrender. Canadian enlistment at this point looked a lot like it did in World War I. Quebec and French Canada generally, here, I'll go back to this one. Quebec and French Canada generally were sending fewer soldiers than English Canada. By June 1941, it was 40% less. Anti-French feeling was strong among the general staff, including comments from one anonymous general who said, quote, "I hate the sight of the French Canadians. None of them should go over the rank of lieutenant colonel." I don't know why lieutenant colonel is the important one, but anyway. Intelligence reports showed widespread hostility to French soldiers and officers, as well as others like Jews and blacks. There was no French training camp, and no one wanted to set one up because, as General Currie said in the First World War, what happens when the two groups have to cooperate? There was no thought, right, that any Anglo officer should learn French. It had to be the other way around. The Ministry of National Defense tended to view the Québécois as backwards and therefore only suited to be the bullet catchers at the front, rather than doing the more technical jobs in the Air Force, Navy, or technical corps of the Army. Meanwhile, Tory conscriptionists, led by former Prime Minister Arthur Mahan, who again was the architect of conscription in the First World War, urged Mackenzie King to bring in conscription and force the French to fight. Mackenzie King was famous for being, above all things, a waffler and a pragmatic and strategic politician who was certain to never take a firm position on anything. That way he could always get out of it. On April 27th, 1942, he said that every Canadian would vote on the question, and here's the question: are you in favor of releasing the government from any obligations arising out of any past commitments restricting the methods of raising men for military service? End quote. Okay. The question was not, shall we have conscription, which is what the Conservatives wanted. Okay. It was simply to open the possibility that we could have conscription. All right. So in a typically mealy-mouthed statement, King said the results of the referendum would be, quote, conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription, which is a nonsense expression. Okay. Oh, no, sorry, here. So this was where the conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. French Canada, meanwhile, didn't believe it for a second, okay? In the famous words of America's 43rd president, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, won't get fooled again. A campaign from Quebec for a no vote began under an umbrella organization called La Ligue pour la Défense du Canada, or the LPDC. Okay. So the LPDC means, the League for the Protection of, the League for the Defense of Canada. It began with a few intellectuals associated with the nationalist Catholic journal L'Action Nationale, but it grew to include the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste, the Montreal Catholic Labor Council, the Voyageurs de Commerce, basically the Chamber of Commerce, and various farm and youth groups, basically most of French Canadian civil society. Their main publicity arm was the newspaper Le Devoir, which you may remember was edited by Henri Bourassa. The LDPC argued that the only reason King would want to be released from his promise is because he intended to break it. Otherwise, why bother? But more upsetting to French Canadians, treasonous even, was the fact that the pledge against conscription was made to Quebec alone, or at least that's how Quebec saw it. Now, all of Canada was being asked to release the government for a pledge it only made to French Canadians. Where was the justice? So the LDPC was attacked relentlessly on the CBC and the liberal newspapers in the province, but it didn't matter. Just like in the First World War, the results showed a total division of Canada and Quebec, of English Canada and Quebec into two solitudes, all right? The overall result for all of Canada was 65.63% yes, 34.37% no. But when it's broken down, we see the divisions. Quebec voted 72.9% against conscription. 6 heavily French Canadian ridings outside Quebec also voted against it, as did a few prairie ridings with high immigrant numbers. But everywhere else in Canada, the majority in every province except Quebec voted overwhelmingly in favor of conscription. In Ontario, it was 82.3% for conscription. All right. If you take out the Quebecois English votes, and then you take out the French votes in the rest of Canada, you've basically got two blocks: a solidly French no and a solidly English yes. Okay, let's just take a look here at. So there are your referendum results. Okay, so if you look at Quebec, 73% no, 27% yes. Keep in mind that the English population of Quebec at that time was roughly 20 to 25%, okay? And I'm going to guess most of those votes are here. On the other hand, here's the result for the rest of Canada. 66% say yes to conscription, and 34%, and this includes Quebec, say no. Again, if you took all the English votes out of Quebec and took all the French votes out of the rest of Canada, you'd probably end up with a fairly even yes-no divide among, a fairly unanimous yes vote among the English, and a fairly unanimous, not exactly, but a fairly unanimous no vote among the French. Okay. So the result was not what Mackenzie King had wanted. He was at least hoping for something close to 50% in Quebec, but he didn't get it. As a result, even though he technically won the referendum, he lost it, which was where it was most important, which was in Quebec. Quebec was not willing to be drafted. English Canada, meanwhile, was demanding that Quebecers be drafted. There was the impasse. It was because of elections like these that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there are these great constitutional debates in Canada. And one of the things Quebec wanted was a veto over the other provinces on constitutional amendments. They did this because they did not want the English provinces ganging up on them like they did in the referendum of 1942. And like the unity election, the Union election of 1917. Okay, so here's an ad in a newspaper, actually. I'm not sure which one it is, but it says at the top, si vous voulez éviter la conscription, voici où vous ferez votre croix au plébiscite du 27 avril. So if you want to not have conscription, then this is where you're going to put your mark. No, no. And then here's the question that I read to you in English before. Okay. So this is an advertisement from a newspaper saying, if you don't want to be conscripted, vote no. Here are your referendum results again. The army of zombies. So what the government did was it created the nation of zombies. Zombie was a disparaging term used for soldiers who were drafted into the NERMA. Remember, NERMA was the one that could not be sent overseas, okay? Could not be sent overseas. By the beginning of 1943, two things had happened. It became even clear that Germany and Japan were going to lose the war, but it was also clear that they were determined to fight to the very, very bitter end. Second, Canada was totally mobilized with 39% of its population, not 39% of its able-bodied adults or able-bodied men. 39% of the entire population from zero to the oldest person, okay, was mobilized to work for the war, either in industry, farming, or in the military itself, all right? By February 1942, every battalion in Canada had some NERMA conscripts in it, okay? But because of King's promise not to send troops overseas, the promise still held, even though the referendum was finished. These men could not even go to the US, all right? By August 43, they were released to go all over North America, but what was the point, really? In the end, a bunch went to the Bahamas. Sounds pretty cool. Meanwhile, GS troops, the General Service troops, volunteers who could be sent anywhere, put heavy pressure on zombies to sign up for overseas duties. And this worked a lot better with English-speaking units than with French ones. The zombie troops did serve well within Canada. There were very few reports of ill discipline, very few reports of shirking. but they didn't want to go overseas. General George Peakes, the commanding officer in British Columbia, said, quote, "No man," he told this to the soldiers, "no man should wear that khaki uniform unless he is willing to wear it anywhere. Many young soldiers are quite satisfied to say they are doing their duty by defending the coasts. This is not 100% service. The appeal has gone out to every soldier to volunteer heart and soul to support his comrades who are now ready to launch the invasion." By invasion, of course, he meant D-Day, which hadn't happened yet, but everyone knew it was coming. These speeches didn't work much either, unfortunately. Another ad campaign in 1944 encouraged zombies to join up with the GS and be proud of wearing a GS badge on their arms. They'd say, quote, "You can't share the victory unless you are ready and willing to take your place with the boys who are earning it." Most zombies found the ads offensive and stupid. Okay, so it got really serious in 1944. Though Canadians had had casualties from the botched raid on Dieppe, the fall of Hong Kong, the invasion of Italy, as well as casualties in the air and sea, they were not prepared for the massive death and destruction that the invasion of northwestern Europe would bring. As most of you know, on the 6th of June, 1944, British, American, and Canadian forces landed in Normandy for what would be the largest amphibious invasion in the history of war. This was followed by 11 months of brutal combat, and Canadians were involved in it to the teeth. Casual lists in the newspapers became much, much longer, and lists of reinforcements grew much shorter. This meant that anger at shirkers, especially French ones, grew. The Conservative Party demanded conscription for overseas service now. King was under heavy pressure from his own liberal cabinet. Polls showed heavy, but not overwhelming, support for conscription in English Canada. The English language newspapers, even liberal ones, were unanimous. Conscription now. The French language newspapers, meanwhile, had their own reply. You send us overseas by force and you tear this nation apart. Ever the wily politician, King eventually found a compromise. He drafted 16,000 zombies to fight in the general service. Most of the men who were to be drafted were stationed in BC to deal with the possibility of a Japanese invasion, one which is now impossible because the Japanese Navy had been almost wiped out by the Americans. Still, in Vernon, British Columbia, 1,000 soldiers marched through the streets shouting no to conscription. It's unclear if these soldiers were majority French or English. In Terrace, on the northwest coast of BC, things got completely out of hand when a French-Canadian unit, Les Fusiliers de Saint-Laurent, armed themselves and mounted anti-tank guns to command the approaches to the base. 4 days later, officers realized they had a Quebecois mutiny going on in Terrace, BC. Fortunately, the events petered out and no one was charged. The general insisted it was just a few ringleaders and some kids having some horseplay. In English and French-speaking units, there was a high degree of absenteeism, rioting, sit-down strikes, and overall a large reluctance to go overseas. In one famous case, a soldier threw his kit bag and his rifle into the sea as he boarded a ship for England. This was just one soldier, but it became emblematic of the feelings most zombies had. Censorship kept the worst stories out of the press. But especially in Quebec, the rumor mill and the gossip line was very, very powerful. Advertisements were put up throughout Quebec warning the citizenry that harboring a deserter was a criminal offense. And there were raids by the RCMP and military police. In Drummondville, in Quebec, February 24th, 1945, a 100-man raiding party was attacked by a mob who overturned their vehicles and smashed and overturned their vehicles while street fighting raged for 3 hours. By the end of the war, 12,908 Nurma conscripts were sent overseas, and 2,463 went to fight in northwestern Europe. Of these, 69 were killed, 232 wounded, 13 taken prisoner. Reinforcements came from Italy, which we'll discuss soon. The Nazis surrendered on May 8th, 1945. The question of whether conscripts would be sent to Japan was heated, but it was short since Japan surrendered 4 months later. Few Canadians or Quebecers saw any action in the Pacific Theater beyond the defense of Hong Kong. So what do we got here? So here's a sign that I think speaks for itself by a group of Nerma soldiers whom I believe are up in Terrace, BC. Okay, so now we're going to go to the fighting. Despite the battle over conscription, and despite what English Canada might have thought, many French Canadian men and women joined up. It's estimated that more than 160,000 French Canadians put on uniforms, and most of them served in one of 4 French language infantry units. So there was Le Fusilier Mont-Royal, Le Régiment de Maisonneuve, Le Régiment de la Chaudière, you don't need to know all these, and the Royal 22nd Regiment, the 22nd, which you may remember from the First World War as the infamous Vendus. All right. Others served in the 4th Medium Regiment, the Royal Canadian Artillery. In all of these units, these 5 units, French was the everyday working language. But significantly, administration and communication with other units took place in English only. Many French also served in Quebec armored regiments, the Three Rivers Regiment and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment, which were also sent overseas. These regiments function in English. You should notice as well that 4 out of the 5 French-speaking units are infantry. And if you know about war, it's the infantry, the everyday rifleman, who is often first to die in battle. And although it's a job that requires an enormous amount of courage and guile, it is not a job that requires a lot of education. So unless you could work in English, these really were your choices as far as the Royal Canadian Army went. There was also the Royal Canadian Air Force. In 1942, the RCAF created a largely Francophone squadron, number 425, the Alouettes, which flew bombers as part of the Canadian 6th Group in the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command. Their job was to drop bombs on German military targets and more than a few civilian ones as well. This was the limit of French participation in the air. As for the Royal Canadian Navy, out of 1,140 warships, not one functioned in French. 1,140 ships, 0 French. French Canadian sailors were therefore spread across the Navy's bases and ships, or chose a different line of work. Much the same held true for the Merchant Navy. A lot of French Canadians thought, well, if you want us to join up, maybe you should set up some units that actually speak our language. All right. We don't have time to go over for every French Canadian unit in Europe, so let's look at the Vendus again, whom we met in World War I. So by the end of 1939, the regiment was back in England. Like most of the Western Allies, they cooled their heels for a few years while the heavy fighting took place in the East and in Africa. In July 43, after North Africa was liberated, the Allies began Operation Husky, the code name for the invasion of Sicily off the Italian coast. On July 10th, the Vendus landed on the beaches in an amphibious assault with the 1st Canadian Infantry. The battle took 38 days and cost 2,100 Allied lives, including Canadians, Brits, and Americans. And though it was rough going, the difference between fighting the war and fighting this war and fighting World War I was that in this war, the battles were fluid, okay? You won, you lost. You gained ground, you lost ground, but you didn't sit in trenches for years and years, just exchanging shell fire. Things moved, right? Once the Nazis and fascists had been pushed out of Sicily, Mussolini's fascist state collapsed, and Germany had to reinforce his troops and invade Italy. This diverted troops from the Eastern Front, including the decisive tank battle at Kursk. which the Soviets would win, and which was a very, very, very important battle, possibly the most important one after Stalingrad and D-Day. Following the Battle of Sicily, the invasion of the Italian peninsula proper began. So here's a little map for you. So this is just the Canadian Army generally, all right? So I'm not sure, they're not all Vandus, but so they land down here in Sicily in the southeast and basically move their way up through the east, okay? The rest of it here is mostly the province of the British and the Americans. This is all very hilly territory. It's all mountain fighting, which is can be difficult. Then they invade the toe of Italy, so up through Calabria. If you've never been here, you have to go up through here until we get to Ortona, which is on the Adriatic coast here of Italy. Okay. The most serious battle of the Italian front for Canadian forces would be Ortona. In the final weeks of 1943, in the final weeks of 43, Ortona was the last battle on the Adriatic front, okay, the east coast of Italy. The 1st Canadian Infantry, which included the Vandus, were ordered to take the town, a high, hilly place that normally had 10,000 people, but was now mostly just rats. The 1st Canadians had a few weeks fighting experience in Sicily, but they were nowhere near as experienced as the German 1st Parachute Division, which came to meet them in Ortona. The German 1st Parachute had been fighting for 3 years solid now, and were a brutally efficient piece of Hitler's killing machine. The battle was house to house, street by street, alley to alley. The city was laced with booby traps. So, for example, the Germans would set up hidden machine guns or anti-tank cannons, right? Which slowed everything down and made it very hard to move. The Canadians used a technique for house-to-house fighting that was called mouse holing. Instead of going through the front door, what you do is you stick a mine on the side of the wall, right? The mine explodes, there's a hole in the wall, and in the chaos, you throw grenades through the wall. Then soldiers follow the grenades and clear the house room by room, staircase by staircase with grenades and machine guns. 20 years ago, I was a journalist. When I was a journalist, I interviewed a guy who had fought in Ortona when he was 17, and he wouldn't describe it to me. He simply said, "I would never understand." Right? At the time, they called it Little Stalingrad. It was so vicious. It lasted 8 days until the Germans retreated and the Canadians took the town at a cost of roughly 2,300 Canadian casualties, about 500 of them dead. If I focus a lot on Ortona, it's because it was a singularly Canadian battle, but was also where Paul Triquet won French Canada's only Victoria Cross in World War II. Technically, it was actually during the preparation for the battle. Triquet was a 33-year-old captain in the Vandus. According to his VC citation, and I quote, "On the 14th of December, 1943, during the attack on Casa Berardi, Italy, when all the other officers and half the men of his company had been killed or wounded, Captain Triquet dashed forward and, with the remaining men, broke through the enemy resistance. He then forced his way on with his small force, now reduced to 2 sergeants and 15 men, into a position on the outskirts of Casa Berardi. They held out against attacks from overwhelming numbers until the remainder of the battalion relieved them the next day. Through the actions of Captain Triquet's utter disregard for danger and his cheerful encouragement were an inspiration to his men." End quote. Okay, now many Canadians did stay in Italy and fought their way up Italy for the duration of the war. But in the late winter and early spring of 1945, Operation Goldflake began. And this was to move Canadian troops in Italy to northwestern Europe, where other Canadian units were fighting their way through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. The Vandus served in the liberation of the Netherlands, but the problem is there are very few battlefield histories in French-Canadian units. Then there's always the story of Private Léo Major, an undisciplined former farmer from near Montreal. He lost his left eye in June 1944 to a German grenade. No problem, he said, I have another one. And for the rest of the war, he donned an eye patch. Later, on a mission to rescue surrounded British soldiers, Major drove over a landmine in his truck. He was thrown 50 feet into the air, broke one arm, 3 vertebrae, and both his legs, both his ankles. He ran away from the Belgian hospital to visit a girlfriend, and he decided to just rejoin his old unit while he was out. During the Battle of Scheldt in the Netherlands in October 44, the 1st Canadian Army was assigned the task of clearing German troops to allow Allied supplies to go to Antwerp. Private Major swam through canals undetected before killing 2 sentinels at a German army camp. He ambushed the German commanding officer and then took 93 German prisoners alone. He had to call in Canadian tanks and march the soldiers to the Canadian lines. But Major's greatest victory was the liberation of Zwolle, Z-W-O-L-L-E, a picturesque Dutch city with a population of about 50,000 at the time. After sunset on April 13th, 1945, Major and another Quebecois soldier, Willie Arsenault, sneaked into the German-held town on a reconnaissance mission. The area was swarming with German soldiers and Arsenault was killed. Incensed, Major gunned down the 2 Germans who had killed his friend. He then walked into the German officer quarters where he persuaded a senior German officer who spoke French that the village was surrounded by Canadian soldiers. He told him to tell his fellow officers to evacuate immediately or face being captured when the town fell. As a sign of good faith, he let the German officer keep his gun. Major then proceeded to charge through the town to simulate a siege of an encroaching army. With the aid of Dutch resistance officers, he captured more than 50 German soldiers. Other Germans fled and the town was liberated. After the war, Major returned to his home in Quebec, which this time was better equipped than the last time to welcome the men and women home. So let's just take a look at some more pictures, okay? So there's obviously from the liberation of Holland. Okay, so this takes you through the, this is Northwest Europe, obviously. Okay, so here's Normandy. I wish I had a better map, but I don't really, not one that is this detailed. So here you have the beaches, right? So the Canadian beach was called Juno Beach. And I believe it was the furthest east, or it might have been between. Anyway, it was right here. Sorry, so it wasn't the furthest east. It was sort of in the center. Now, what you can do is the Canadians are the blue line here. Okay. So here's the 2nd British Army. So they go straight to Antwerp up here. Here's the 1st U.S. Army. They go also through Belgium and then into Germany this way. And then here's another, I think it's the 3rd U.S. Army. That might be Patton's tanks. And they storm through here. The 7th U.S. Army is this way. And then you've also got some coming in from the south because they later invaded through the Mediterranean. The Americans did. So this blue line is the Canadians. Now, if you can look up, you see it obviously follows the North Shore. And Canada's job is to free these northern ports, okay? It's a very important job because once you free these ports up, you can use them to add material, all right? Or to send material. And of course, in the end, Canada was the Canadian Army that freed the Netherlands and that accepted the German surrender in the Netherlands at that time. So there's that. Okay, so here's Léo Major. There he is getting his VC. VC, his Victoria Cross. French Canada's only one. Here are some Vendus. So these are the Vendus, all right, French Canadian soldiers. These pictures are from the Battle of Ortona, okay? these guys are pretty rough. They've been fighting for a few days now. They're tired. So this guy's got a Tommy gun, whereas these guys have the long arms. So these ones would have been more for like mouse holing, for fighting inside the houses, right? Because they fire very fast, but they're short range. Whereas these ones are for sort of more long range combat because they have a bigger range, but they don't fire as quickly. It's another sort of making your way through the hills. So again, through Ortona. So again, any of these holes could be hiding submachine guns, anti-tank cannons, landmines, and then you bring the tanks in, right? I don't know if this is a Canadian tank. Did Canada make its own tanks? Anyway, but those are Canadian soldiers for sure. And the tank is from the Canadian Army. I don't know if we made it or not. And then finally, here's Leo Major. So here he is before so he's missing his eye. Here he is with flowers. So I'm going to assume this would have been like in the last days of the war, or maybe even on VE Day. And then here's the street in Zval that they've named after him. So this is Leo Marjorlan. I'm going to guess lawn means like lane or a road, right? Canadian, don't speak Dutch, but looks like a Canadian something or other in Zval. And there, he was born in 21, and he died in 08. That's the story with him, a great French Canadian and Dutch hero. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll talk soon.